Hey guys, it's Madison, and in this video I'm going to be discussing how I looked up, made a Quizlet set, and studied every single word in this book over the past 8 days. So if you watched my video last week, then you'll already know a little bit about this project. But yeah, basically the reason why I did this was because one of my big goals for this year and just in general for my Korean is to get faster at reading and also to learn more advanced vocabulary, both in kind of non-fiction niches and also in kind of the literary fiction niche as well. And so I thought by doing this project, number one, I would get out of a very long kind of 6-week slump where I was doing basically no language learning at all. So this is kind of a good way for me to jump back in and kind of get excited about doing a project with a language once again, and also just again, like I said, to improve that knowledge of literary fiction vocabulary. I also mentioned in that video that I was a little bit concerned that I would not have enough time to finish the book before I went back to Korea because I'm leaving actually the day after tomorrow, but thankfully, as you can see, I did manage to finish in time. So my original plan was for every single day to read about a chapter of the book and to break down that chapter into several little mini study sessions throughout the day. That way I would not get too overwhelmed by all the new vocabulary that I was studying, since I was, literally reviewing every single new or slightly familiar word. And so in that little mini session, I would just read a few pages, look up all the vocab, make a Quizlet set, review that Quizlet set, take a break, and then a little while later, start it over again and do another little mini session until I finished, again, approximately a chapter per day. I knew that there would likely be a lot of vocabulary building up throughout the week-ish that it would take. And so I thought that by doing it in little small chunks like that, it would make it a lot more bite-sized instead of being too overwhelming. And my hope for this little challenge/project by the end of it was that I would start to notice the author using the same descriptive words to describe things over and over again. I would actually see this new vocab in use multiple times throughout the book. And that by the end, there would, in theory, be noticeably fewer words to look up, because my hypothesis was that authors tend to use the same kind of set descriptive vocabulary over and over again. And so in theory, as I learned more and more of the words that this author likes to use, then the overall new words would get smaller and smaller as the book went on. The reason I chose this book for this project, there's a few reasons actually. First of all, I've read it before, and so that's good for this kind of close reading project. I already kind of know the overall context of the story, and so there wouldn't be any temptation to kind of skip ahead and discover what's happening next in the plot. I could focus more on breaking down all the words I didn't know as I was reading versus, discovering what happens next, basically. Another obvious reason is because it's one of the few books that I have here in this house in the States that are in Korean. And finally, because it is a middle grade book, I figured there would be less unfamiliar literary vocabulary compared to maybe an adult novel that would have, more literary or more advanced vocabulary, is my thought at least. So those are some of the reasons why I chose this book. And also, I just realized this, but today as I'm filming this, it's Valentine's Day, and this book is called 첫사랑 라이브, First Love Live. So there's kind of an on-theme thing happening as well. So yeah, I didn't even plan for that, but that ended up being very on theme. So first, I'm gonna go ahead and go through a quick little day-by-day breakdown of what I did on each day really quickly and kind of how I felt or how things changed throughout the challenge. So first of all, day one, I'm not gonna go too much into detail for because I have a whole vlog, again, my last week's video where I kind of showed that process. So if you're curious about what one of these days look like, you can watch that vlog. But just a really quick recap of my overall thoughts from that day. I ended the day feeling very hopeful for two main reasons. Number one, I was afraid this would take forever to do, and it actually wasn't that bad. And second of all of the vocab from that day was sticking well in my head, even though it was 93 words, which gave me hope that even though I might do a lot of words in a day, as long as I stuck to this little kind of like mini reading session, mini review session, break, rinse and repeat kind of style of doing this reading project, that it would be manageable and not too overwhelming with all the new vocab. Moving on to day two and day three, I feel like I had some good momentum going from day one, but it came to like basically a screeching halt on day two, just because I found another project to work on that I kind of got distracted by. I'll mention it in a future video, but yeah, days 2 and 3, I was very distracted by this other thing I was learning and kind of working on. And so I did a little bit both of those days, but it was definitely kind of very much pushed to the side by this new kind of thing I was learning. But thankfully I did still manage to do a little bit each day. But the downside was that I was beginning to feel unsure if I would finish the book on time before I left for Korea, because my original vision kind of required me doing things every single day, like a decent amount every single day. And so having two very, very, very light days definitely put the whole project into question if I would finish it on time or not. Days 4 and 5, I did manage to get back on track a bit and do a decent amount. However, I began to realize even more that it would be difficult to finish on time because I didn't really have the motivation or energy to do more than like 4 or 5 reading sessions per day. And so I found it difficult to kind of like catch up to where I needed to be to finish on time. And honestly, if I hadn't made that video last week saying I was going to work on this project, I probably would have given up at this point just because it felt a little bit overwhelming, just the amount of things I had to do to finish on time. As far as the actual vocab goes, it was still going fine. Even though the total number of words was beginning to build up by this point, I would start off each day with a kind of big review session of every single previous day's vocab, and then I would move into my kind of mini reading sessions for that day. By day 6, that began to change because there were so many vocab words that reviewing all of them at the beginning of each day was a bit overwhelming, so I would just review a few days of the previous day's catalog of words before moving into my reading for that day. Day 6 in particular was like a big roller coaster just because it started off my first 4 reading sessions with a very, very easy chapter. I was understanding a ton, not looking up a ton of things. And then the next chapter, the beginning, was just very, very, very dense with unfamiliar vocab. So it was like this like good feeling and then like crashing down into a really, really difficult few pages as far as vocab goes. And at this point, I was basically giving up on my hypothesis that the number of words that I was having to look up would decrease throughout the book just because I was realizing it was more of an up and down kind of a thing. Easy passage, then difficult passage, easy few pages, and difficult few pages, rather than just like a steady decrease throughout the book. So I was basically throwing that out and not really even worrying about that anymore. I was just like, I'll just learn some vocab. It's not going to be this nice, pretty graph, but at least I'm learning things. Moving on to day 7. By this point, I was kind of rushing so that I could finish this project on time. And because of that, I started to kind of push myself to read more pages per little mini session of reading, which ended up being a bit of a problem as far as like actually recalling vocabulary, because as I would read more pages per session, the number of words in that Quizlet set would kind of get bigger and bigger. And so often if I made it, beyond 15 or 20 words, I would not actually even like recognize some of the words in the list. I'd be like, did I look this up and write this down? It was actually kind of like scary how I would look at a flashcard and think, I looked at this word apparently like 10 minutes ago and I don't even recall it because I was just going through the motions of looking things up and reading as quickly as possible versus actually taking the time to pay attention to the words on the page. So day 8, I really kind of calmed myself down, took those lessons to heart, and really focused on reading in much smaller chunks. Day 8 was the last day of this challenge. I actually was planning on doing 9 days, but because I had a really good momentum worked up on day 8, I thought, I could just finish today, and I did. So I was very happy with day 8. I read like almost double the amount I'd been reading previously on most of the days, so that was a really productive day. But even though I read a ton more than the earlier days, because I was being really mindful about reading in small chunks, stopping once I got to like 10 to 15 words in a little session Quizlet, the vocab review was going more smoothly. Because of that, I had more motivation, and so I was more willing to keep going and keep reading, even though it was way more than I'd been doing previously. Also, I think as I got closer to the end, I was excited about the project finishing and just being over, and so it also motivated me to, keep pushing forward and just finish in that day. I think another factor that played into my finishing on this day was the fact that for some reason, even though I have read this before and like the gist of most of the plot is still in my head, the last 2 chapters were just gone. Like as I was reading it, I was like, what? This happened? I've read this before? Like I know I finished this book before, but the last 2 chapters were just totally wiped from the memory bank, and so it was actually kind of interesting and fun to read because I didn't know it was going to happen. So that's probably also another big reason why I did push to finish on day 8. So that is the gist of how this project went day by day. Now, big question, would I do this kind of thing again? Yes, I would, but some big caveats. I would not do it in the same way that I did this time, just because doing it on a time crunch was really stressful and overwhelming. I would not recommend that. I think spreading it out and giving yourself time to be able to read smaller chunks every single day would be much more beneficial versus really cramming it in over just 8 days. Especially if I am committing myself to look up every single unfamiliar word. Having time to do it at my own pace with more motivation would be much more fun and enjoyable rather than feeling, stressed that I have to finish it in a certain number of days. Also, I think this challenge of trying to study every single new word I encounter would go a lot more smoothly if I could reread each section like the next day, because that way it would reinforce all those kind of new pathways. I would re-see those words in their original contexts. And I think a lot of the vocab would just stick better if I did have the time to reread each section the day after or whenever as a different form of review versus just seeing a flashcard. I actually kind of wanted to do that for this book, but I just didn't have the time and I knew I wouldn't finish in time if I did that, so I just didn't do it. But in the future, I think I definitely would incorporate that as part of the review, and I think it would definitely help the word stick a lot better. Very briefly, I do want to mention some numbers from this challenge as far as the overall words that I looked up. It was 631 over 8 days. So that's just under 80 per day on average, which obviously is a lot. It's another reason why I would spread this out more in the future if I had another chance to do something like this again, which I probably will do again. Because I am on vacation, it was definitely feasible, but it was not necessarily the most enjoyable thing to do on average, 80 words a day, plus reviewing words from old days and stuff. And so it was just a little bit overwhelming. So yeah, I think I'm happy with what I did, but it was a little bit stressful. I will put a chart up on the screen as well that shows the time I spent every single day on reading as well as the total. You can definitely see that the second and third days I was distracted by my other project, and that the last day I did much more than the previous days. And that's just the reading time. If you add the time spent reviewing Quizlets, it ends up being this chart. So yeah, as you can see, this project took quite a bit of time out of the past week-ish of my life. As far as my initial hypothesis that the number of unfamiliar words would kind of decrease as I read the book, like I already mentioned, I had already kind of given up on that idea as a whole as I was reading, as I realized that it was a lot more up and down than just like a nice steady decrease. But just for funsies, I did kind of make a plot of the number of unknown words per page per each reading session that I did each day. And after I did that, I realized there actually was a downward trend, a little bit. So even though there are definitely ups and downs throughout the book, as far as like sections with a lot of new vocab versus sections with very little new vocab, I was actually really happy to confirm that actually there was a slight overall downward trend as the book went on. Something else I noticed as I was reading was the fact that I never had to look up a word twice, meaning once I looked a word up, I never didn't recognize it again in the book. And there were many times that I did see the same word repeated throughout different chapters and different areas of the book, and I actually was able to remember them and be like, oh look, there's the word for bleary-eyed once again. It was actually a really rewarding feeling to notice the words or phrases that I'd already looked up reappear throughout the book and be like, oh, there's that again, oh, there's that again, and realize like, oh, maybe this is like actually a really common phrase, but I always just skip over it because I understand it through context and never actually bothered to look it up. But now that I do know it, I'm actually noticing it and seeing it, and hopefully it's being reinforced and will stay in the brain for a long time. And finally, even though I did mention this briefly before, I really noticed how tired I am and how much I focus on words really affects how much information sticks in my head. That may sound obvious, and I guess it kind of is, but I really noticed the times where I really gave a lot of focus to the words in a sentence and how they work together. And like when I looked up a word, I would look back at the sentence and like think about it a lot more. Those words really stuck with me versus where I was just kind of reading sentences, looking up words, making flashcards, and just not really giving a lot of actual like deep thought to what I was doing. Those are the times where I would go back to a flashcard set and be like, this word was there, and just realizing that even though I had done the work of actually looking at the word and like writing it down, because I hadn't like really been giving my full attention to it, my full like thought to it, it did not stick around in the brain. So it really showed me that paying attention and like really giving thought to everything I was doing was really important, obviously, and the more deliberate focus I put on the activity, the more it stuck in my head. So again, if you're planning on doing this, I really encourage you to really give your full attention to the activity because it really makes a big difference in how much actually sticks up there. So yeah, that's it for this little project. I am very happy that I did it, even though it was a bit more overwhelming and stressful than I had hoped it would be at the beginning. Like I said already, I do want to do this again with another book in the future. However, changing it up a little bit, like I said, like doing less per day, spreading it out more, and also rereading sections just to kind of refresh and re-cement those words in the actual context I learned them in versus just flashcards. I think it was actually a really interesting comparison between this activity of reading this book versus when I did this for the topic practice papers last November. Both involved me looking up and studying a lot of specific vocab over the course of just over a week. However, the words in this project stuck so much more in my head, and I think it's because the context of this whole book and the whole storyline being in my head helped me remember the words and the context they were in better. Whereas the test paper, it's like a bunch of little excerpts, and so there's not like one overall context connecting all the readings together, and so it was a lot harder to recall individual words and the context they belonged in. So I think studying vocab through a bigger context like this is a lot more helpful for me, at least, to actually recall things in the context they are used. One final thought for the end of this video: even though I did learn, or at least study, 631 words throughout the course of this book, I'm fairly confident that I'm going to forget a good chunk because I'm not planning on reviewing these Quizlet sets at all into the future. The reason why is because I was just reviewing as I read so that if the words showed up again in the book, I would recognize and recall the meanings. However, as I move on from this book, the context of those flashcards will get more hazy to my mind, and so I feel like the actual flashcards are not going to be very helpful to me anymore, so I'm just going to not worry about doing them in the future. And so because of that, I'm quite sure I'm going to forget some of these words, but I am pretty confident that a good chunk of those words I actually will recall in context in books in the future. And that is the whole point that I did this project in the first place. But yeah, that's it for this video. I will see you guys in the next one from Korea, and until then, annyeong.